Hi, everybody. We're just going to get started in a minute as people trickle in. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Let's get started. We have a lot of people on board, so which is super exciting. Okay, so just to introduce myself, I'm Elaine Chang. I'm the Senior Manager of Global Market Development for TaroWorks. In my conversations with people who are thinking about using mobile data collection for monitoring and evaluation, I like to emphasize that tools like TaroWorks are really here to help enable you to execute your program. But you still really need to firstly start with a solid design of a system and have a deep understanding of the details of how you're going to get that data you need. So the question we're going to tackle today is, what are the components of a solid monitoring system? And that's why we're super excited to have Niamh Barry join us to share her 7 principles for how to design your monitoring system to set it up for success. Niamh's just been appointed as Grameen Foundation's Global Head of Monitoring and Evaluation and has set up monitoring systems for multiple programs in countries around the world. So before I turn it over to Niamh, there are some housekeeping items. And just to kick off with a quick poll as I go through these as I go through these housekeeping items. So hopefully you see that poll on your screen, so you can start to click in about what your common pain points around system design is. Okay, so in terms of housekeeping items, just to let you know that this call is being recorded. And because of the number of people on the call, everyone is muted by default. Niamh will be going through a presentation and taking questions at the end. If you have a question at the end, raise your hand and I'll unmute you. As you become unmuted, just share your name and organization. And you can also type your question in.
Are we all seeing that?
Oh, yep. I can see it.
Great. Great. So good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. I just want to say a little bit about myself, following on from what Elaine has said. So my name is Niamh Barry, despite the spelling, and I'm currently working as the Global Head of M&E for Grameen Foundation, and I'm based out of Uganda at the moment. So this is my 8th year of working in research and monitoring and evaluation, and I've worked in a few countries, mainly long-term in Zambia, Sierra Leone, Thailand, and Uganda, where I've been for about close to 4 years now. Within M&E, as you no doubt know, there's so many areas in which you can specialize. So a little favorite of mine is system design, so specifically monitoring system design. So the more complex, the more interesting. So I get a real kick out of systemic change programming and kind of trying to work around developing out for that. So in terms of the sectors that I've worked in and developed M&E systems for, it's been quite broad. So working in sexual reproductive health, water and sanitation, nutrition, child development, education, and partnerships. But in recent years, I've had a very specific focus on agriculture, markets themselves, and financial services. And in the last few years, it's been a huge emphasis on technology in the solutions that we provide. So currently, in my current role, my responsibility for Grameen Foundation is quality assurance over our global our programs M&E designs. So we currently work in 3 main sectors. So that's financial services, mobile health, and mobile agriculture. And our biggest programs are in Colombia, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, India, and the Philippines. So just to manage expectations around this webinar, it's not aimed at one way to build a monitoring system. As we know, there is no one way, as all monitoring systems, end up being quite unique to the project. And they must be starting with a theory of change at its foundation and aligned indicators at each of these outcomes. So this webinar is actually focused on your approach to your design and implementation of monitoring systems. So it's articulated around seven principles that I tend to follow. So during this, I might also be referencing one of our programs. It's called the Community Knowledge Worker Program, or CKW, and it's an agriculture program that is one of our flagship programs here in Uganda. And it uses community-based extension workers trained and supported with mobile extension apps. So just to make the point that this is a kind of a principal approach that we used when we were designing for this system, and we used TaroWorks to help us there. So it's great and super interesting to hear about your common pain points, and very intrigued to see that the majority of you see one of the pain points is that development of monitoring system happens in the middle of the program. This is yeah, it's unfortunately very, very common. Lack of budget, also a problem, and buy-in as well. So it's really, really, really interesting, and this is just emphasizing some of the points that monitoring systems need to be built in at the start. So right away. So M&E practitioners should really be coming in at proposal stage and at design phase. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. So in terms of kind of not so common, it's not so obvious, I would say, kind of pain points, is that they may seem small and not so obvious, but these three that I've noted here are pretty impactful, that really, really stunt the growth of monitoring systems within programs as well. So the first in process, quite a number of you end up having a monitoring system, or you end up collecting data, but this data is not actually aligned to a theory of change that it. So you end up collecting information, it exists in its own space, and it does itself in the last 12 months. So this is broad, but it essentially means having a program where the program implementation team and the M&E team operate in silos. So M&E becomes they do, i.e. the M&E team, or they want, i.e. the donors, and it's not seen as something the program do to run a successful implementation. Voted by 42% of you is, hiring the right talent, the capacity to design and implement. And the first one is really about involving everybody. So far too frequently, and your terms and text for all of their starts with, the buy-in, and how do we start to think about getting broader buy-in. So I've often found that getting everybody at your proposal stage, and then everybody is going to be working on executing that project, and to start to be able to articulate the program's theory of change, why we think a set of activities will simulate a particular sequence of outcomes, and how that will actually happen. And is actually, most people have just not been involved, and they really see this as something, as a separate function, and not something they can do. However, the reality is that this is program design, and it's crucial for project designers and managers to develop. And we need to facilitate and create a system where we work together in an organization. For example, having reps on the proposal team that would cover everybody who's going to be involved in the actual implementation, in order to overcome this. So organizational culture is towards much earlier and not later. So we don't come in of development happens in the middle, and we don't have buy-in, and we don't sit. So this one is about knowing the project in depth, and what kind of HR capacity assessments across other programs. This is something that I find too often lacking. So I guess this links back into the silos. So for M&E practitioners to actually develop out a monitoring system, they need to know the project inside out. So this includes, obviously, the desired changes, the processes, i.e. the activities by which the change is expected to take place, and the resources available to actually enact that change. For example, if you have a field team who are going to be interacting with your target population for your project, you'll need to be able to know their schedule, so you know their interaction points, and the purpose of each interaction point in order to be able to integrate this within your design. You cannot build a system without this deep knowledge, and this is really another emphasis on breaking down the silos that tend to exist. The third principle seems like potentially a little bit of a rogue principle, but it's related to buy-in, which is the most crucial aspect of building systems. So I've often found that there's so many terms within monitoring and evaluation, extremely intimidating sector. So this tends to facilitate what I've termed the otherness and a reluctance to engage with monitoring and evaluation. To be perfectly honest, when I started out in by all the terms that were out there in the sector, so I used to spend time trying to figure out the difference between an M&E plan and an M&E framework, or figuring out the difference between outcome mapping, logic. And you go online and you'll research and you'll find a ton of manuals saying something slightly different organizations. So turn it around to what is the product getting here? And once the M&E practitioners are able to do that, they must be able to share this kind of demystifying of the sector with the program teams as well to break down those silos. As I say, for example, Don't just talk about a theory of change model and give somebody a manual in a program team and ask them for strands. For example, I feel the activities they develop reach the final goal. What needs to happen first? What needs to happen in tandem? You know, or if you're looking at impact, and you know, we have all these other terms like goal and so on. And you just need to like turn around again and begin to program teams when you're facilitating this. You know, what is the final state that you want your project participants to be in at the end of this project? So I found that this really, really helps in bringing the implementation teams along with you in the design and facilitating a lot more buy-in. So the fourth one here is about keeping it simple. So this is getting into the design aspect now. So as Albert Einstein had famously said, keep it simple, but never simpler. So how do we keep it simple? So it starts at the foundation. So having a well-defined theory of change and having very clear indicators aligned to that theory of change. Now, I've often, unfortunately, seen a theory of change, and then in a separate spreadsheet, I've seen a set of indicators. And sometimes these things do not work together. They're not aligned. But by developing out simple outcome statements that you've worked with the team and just putting 1 to 2 indicators that would help you, well, indicate that that has been achieved. And that would ensure that we start to think about what are our data needs first. So there's often a difference between data needs and data wants. So my experience is 1 or 2 of the extremities, trying to get programs who you know want nothing to do with you, or programs who want it all, want an excessive amount of information. And quite often it's on the excessive amount, I've found. But what I like to do is kind of work with the program teams to understand the data needs first, and then their likes to have, and then just talk them through their ability to actually analyze, digest, and use all of this data that they've requested. So I find that this process helps letting go of the wants, which can come later as the system is stabilized when we're trying to keep it simple at first. So I just want to share with you an example of when we were also trying to keep it simple with our community knowledge worker program in Uganda. So just a quick little snapshot on this program. So we work with 300 community knowledge workers who are basically farmers within the community. And we train them on extension, and we facilitate this by having a mobile application that has a lot of content on the value chains that their farmers are interested in. So these 300 CKWs or community knowledge workers, work with over 15,000 farmers in Uganda at the moment. So the information dissemination part that they do on good agricultural practices happens through 2 methods, and that is through facilitating one-to-one farm visits and group meetings. So when we had a quick look at our more simple, this is just a simple synopsis of a theory of change, it was very much a focus on farmers adopting GAPs, so good agricultural practices. So, but you know, eventually we want to see an effect of these GAPs, which is, you know, improving yield and incomes of these farmers. So we were quite lucky in terms of the program design that, based on the interactions of the community knowledge workers, we could actually measure adoption of good agricultural practices in real time. because they had, during the season, had these natural one-on-one farm visits in which they could check if the good agricultural practice was actually adopted. So technically at this point, we could have also started gathering real-time information on yield and sales. But we decided that this gap adoption was pretty complex already, and this was the first time the community knowledge workers were actually going to do this. So we decided to leave yield and income at the evaluation level. When we started looking at our indicators, we put those ones at the higher level to the evaluation. And we kept our monitoring system as simple as possible. You know, and if we continue this on, then we can think about having real-time yield and real-time sales data coming in. But at the moment, we decided to keep it simple at first so as not to overwhelm the agents on the ground. So the next principle is about building slowly and into existing structures. So not everything happens all at once in a project. There may be certain things that, particularly in agricultural projects, that are seasonal. And so if you can phase in the building of certain tools, very much do so, so you don't overwhelm the team as they start monitoring. So we really need to avoid making monitoring an existing activity. And what's important in doing that is to understand the natural touch points that exist in a project and to utilize these. So, for example, when we looked at the people who are on the ground, we have CKWs, the community knowledge workers. There's also the higher level super CKW, who acts as a buffer to manage certain groups of CKWs. And we also have our field officer. And so we broke down what exactly their activities are. And with the CKW, we saw that they're supposed to do one-to-one farmer interaction. They're supposed to do cluster meetings, farmer cluster meetings, and they're supposed to do good agricultural practices adoption checks. And with the super CKWs, they're supposed to do the same, plus they were intended to update local market prices. And our field officer main activity was to ensure that they had monthly meetings with the CKWs under their supervision. So we just pulled out these activities that they're doing on an ongoing basis and began to look at the forms that we actually need. So we made it very simple in this thing. We have 3 main activities, then we have 3 main forms. And what we also do is that we try to ensure that the form mimics what is actually going on in that activity. So, for example, in a farmer cluster meeting, the main things that the CKW is required to do is to take attendance and to discuss and highlight and give practicals on certain good agricultural practices that are in line with the season. And so, essentially, the form mimics that reality. And thus, it's just a question of ticking out what you're actually doing. So it's not something that's additional. And so it becomes very much needs-based, and we're collecting exactly what happened. So my 6th principle is really about having a minimal tolerance for bad data. I've seen some pretty sweet monitoring systems that look great on paper, but once you get into them, their impact is severely reduced by not enough quality assurance systems being integrated into the system. So if you don't have data you can trust, then you don't have a monitoring system. So bad data, as I'm sure everybody here has experienced, is pretty unavoidable. But I still feel it's so important to keep your standards very high. And we need to ensure that monitoring systems build in quality control and quality assurance processes, and that we give constant feedback to the people who implement our system about the quality of the information that's coming. So just to give an example from our community knowledge worker program, so we look at 3 aspects of quality assurance. So the first aspect is desk-based, what I'm calling desk-based quality assurance. So this is with the data coming in, we would look at the data sets and download those and just begin to look at certain elements that seem like outliers, that are just very, very obviously outliers. For example, noting that our CKWs are talking about practices that are really not in line with the season, or things that they shouldn't, or just very simple things like looking at the dates of meetings, checking that that's viable and appropriate, looking at the amount of the people they met to ensure that looks like a sensible, reasonable number. And that kind of stuff is just using your sense and using, based on what the program, how it's intended to work, and looking at the data from that point. We also like to harbor a healthy bit of suspicion of technology. So we also, at least once a month, do a little bit of a tech QA. So this means that we, in the system that I'll have a little talk about at the end of this webinar, we have the raw data going in, which is mapped, and then kind of crunched into more digestible reports. So what we like to do, and particularly at the start of a monitoring system, when you're getting it up and running and you're using technology, is to download the raw data, the raw submissions, and then kind of check that with the crunch synopsis reports to see if they're actually reporting correctly. So just checking that they're not duplicates within there, and that there's no bugs done as well. So I would emphasize that a lot more at the start of implementing the monitoring system, so you can iron out a lot of bugs and not just be surprised 6 months later. The other aspect we do is actually field-based quality assurance. So this is essentially, is what you said true. So it's really, really important for us at Grameen Foundation and this particular program that we are very confident in the good agricultural practices adoption rates. So for us, what we do is that once we get in, because we get in this information in real time every month, we run a sample of farmers who have said they've adopted X or Y practice. And we take a sample of them, and our field officers have 1 week where they just visit the gardens of these farmers and just check on actual adoption. So they will tell us what proportion of the data is actually valid in terms of it's true. And we produce twice a month QA reports that basically help us respond to this. And we also like to visualize them, and we show trends. So hopefully like a reduction in bad data occurring. And I think it's also when your program team and your field agents know that you're implementing a pretty tight quality assurance process, then it kind of ends up limiting the kind of under the mango tree scenarios of bad data as well. So finally, it's about proving your value. I must say that quite often coming into programs, you're often the least popular kid in the class, sometimes with monitoring and valuation. you're seen as that person who's going to make them do work, and you're not really understood. So we are a service. The way I see it is that the M&E team is a service to the program teams. So we need to ensure that we are meeting their needs, and ensure that the products that we produce as the M&E team are engaging. So, for example, making reports clean, simple, and short. Like, this is fundamental. If you're having so much data and you're having a lengthy report on it, you know, for busy teams, like, you're not going to get that level of engagement that you might want. I also highly recommend kind of organizing meetings or building in existing meetings. If there is a weekly program meeting, that every 2 weeks you leave an hour in which you actually discuss the data reports or discuss these summaries. So this will really help your program teams find the time to actually engage and eventually instill in the systems and general management processes. For example, in this particular program, there's the program meeting every week, and on the second week loops, our team comes in and we talk through the summaries that we've produced, and we have requests from the programs if they want us to do a deeper dive on a particular finding. You know, we will do that, and we record that, and we respond to them. So we've got a lot of buy-in that, you know, wasn't initially there at the start, but is certainly there now. And this process of what we call data decision meetings is something that happens very naturally now, and it's instilled within the process after a number of months of facilitating this. So these are just quick examples of, you know, the type of quickie reports that we do. I've seen before in the past that, and certainly I think I was guilty of it years ago, giving just the data sets to people. That is not going to get buy-in from you. So we try to make these simple reports, high-level summaries, and then during the data decision meetings, we can look and actually do a deep dive at certain things they want. For example, there's not enough adoption checks going on, or adoption rates may not be as high as we want, but just to be able to give them a quick snapshot in which to delve further on. So this whole system was created using TaroWorks. And being in this space for some time, like prior to this project and prior to me coming on board in Grameen Foundation, for pretty much years now, I have been searching for this off-the-shelf monitoring systems for the sectors that I've worked in. So I've been looking for this place where we can link in mobile data collection, like to a database that responds well to if you have multiple data collectors, you have multiple forms, and very regular data collection periods, and where we can store and crunch these numbers out. So in the past, I've actually been through the process of building out custom systems. So digitizing essentially monitoring systems for complex programs. But then to do what I wanted, but this requires a lot of cost and a lot of time, and it's often just not flexible. So you could invest it in one program, maybe combine two, but I found that sometimes if I needed to tweak a form, I'd have to call up the developer themselves. So, like in the past few years, as you're well aware, surveying became increasingly mobile-based, and then over the years it's become increasingly easier to use. So we wanted to be able to use the digital form capabilities not just for once-off surveying, but for ongoing monitoring. And in the solutions I've used for surveying, I was always thinking, why can't I just use this for monitoring? But these were very much built for just once-off surveying, download the Excel file, crunch the numbers in Stata and SPSS, and that was it. So when I first came to Grameen Foundation, I found what has become a really winning combination of Salesforce and TaroWorks. So after we as a team had defined out what we require for our monitoring system, the M&E out the forms that we required, as you saw, very simply put, at the natural touch points that we needed. So then from a simple form, we kind of ended up registering our 300 CKWs in the database, and then they registered through their forms 15,000 farmers within the systems. And because the CKWs and farmers are registered in this system, we could link them back to all the monitoring forms, and then we'd be able to actually look at all their interactions together and being able to track everything that that CKW has done and that farmer has done over the project period on the variables that we defined. So, I mean, in saying this, like our tech team had to work with us to map the variables to certain projects so that we could develop and crunch the data points in a way that worked for us. And I just want to share a few. Like, this is like a quick performance report. So we can very easily look at our community knowledge workers and see the performance that they're doing on any given month, how many unique farmers they visit, how many searches they use on the app, how many times they visit their field officer, the proportion of farmers supported, all very easily mapped through the very simple forms that we developed. And so there's another one as well, looking at the farmer cluster we discussed, who was there when it happens. And most importantly for us is the GAP, the Good Agricultural Practices adoption. So we can look at any farmer and their CKW and see what they wanted to be supported on and what they've actually adopted or not adopted where it's relevant to them. So it's been an incredibly successful engagement for our program. But I just want to end on the point that I think Elaine made at the start. So I've seen this occur many times, that it's the silver bullet of technology. And I've seen situations where it is expected that the technology creates the monitoring system. But technology is just the facilitator. It's an enabler. So the monitoring system is created first, always first. And then it's looking at what is the best means for us in which to collect this data. And tech is just one of the means in which to implement one. Okay, guys, that's the end of that. So if you want to start asking questions, please do so, and Elaine will help me facilitate that.
Great, thank you so much, Niamh. Super interesting. I guess this is actually sort of related to your last point of like how do you get that system in place before kind of thinking about tools. But let's see, Akbar Ali had a question kind of around the theory of change and at the very early stages. So can you explain how to align your M&E system to a theory of change for the organization? Yeah.
So, I mean, I can try. That would be a fantastic webinar in itself. So just as a snapshot. So if you're familiar with the theory of change, so all that really is it comes in a diagram quite typically, but what it really is that narrative around you're doing A, B, C activities, and you expect X as the end result. And this kind of tells you kind of what you should be thinking about in the middle. I'm just going to give a real simple example here. So let's say you're providing extension services to farmers. You're also providing linkages to output markets, financial agricultural credits, and input, so buyers as well. So you're doing all these things. So it's about saying, if we're doing all these things, what is the change that we can expect? So you might begin to theorize that, okay, well, the first thing that we expect to happen is that we can actually get farmers to increase their knowledge on these great practices. And if they have the means in which to buy ox plows or fertilizers, which we're also facilitating, then this really increases their chances of a higher yield. And so if they have a higher yield, and we're also facilitating access to the buyers for that particular value chain, then we can hopefully see an increase in sales. And so you can go on. So the main points I've made is that we hope to see a change in knowledge, in adopting practices, and in adopting inputs. We expect to see a change in the yield, and we expect to see a change in the sales. So how that links in is that if we expect to see these changes, this will become the creation. This is the foundation of your monitoring system or your evaluation system. And so you want to develop indicators around those changes. So essentially, and once you start developing the indicators, so, okay, how do I measure an increase in knowledge? Okay, I think we can get that. After they do 6 months, we can do an assessment, and that will be part of your system. Okay, how do I measure yield? Okay, that's only going to happen, in 2 seasons a year, so I think we'll leave that more to the evaluation. So I hope that helps you understand a bit that the theory of change is essentially the foundation of your M&E system. You cannot create an M&E system without that knowledge. I hope that helps.
Great. Quick overview, Niamh, on a huge topic. Cool. Another question was, you mentioned data needs versus data wants, and I guess in my conversations you talk to different stakeholders and they may need different things. So a need for one person might be a want for someone else. So how do you kind of differentiate between a data want and a data need?
Right. Indeed. Right. There's a lot of stakeholders in it. I mean, fingers crossed, everybody's pretty aligned on what we want to see changed. But again, it kind of goes back to what I talked about, the theory of a change. Literally, it's the foundation of everything. So you might, like I've said, in that particular example, I need to measure yield. I need to measure sales. I need to measure adoption rates. These are absolute needs in order to do this. Then you might want somebody saying, I want you to also keep a track of the market prices and how they're fluctuating as well. I want you to do, a set of other things. I want you to measure yield in real time. That's becomes a one. So it's just about this process of absolute needs, and that the needs are essentially linked to the changes you expect to see in the program. The kind of wants, the cooler things to have, they are a little bit later. So it just, again, for me, just stems back into your priorities from your theory of change. Often, yeah, it's not, there's no one solution, but I would revert always back to the theory of change to help us apply that. And it's also about the resources that you have available. If you've got all the resources in the world, you can also implement great little user experiences surveys, every 3 months to check on how people are finding the service or how people are finding the application. But if it becomes burdensome and it's costly and you don't have the resources to meet it, it doesn't, it becomes deprioritized in the M&E system itself. I hope that helps somewhat.
Yeah, great. Just a reminder, you can also raise your hand and I can unmute you. So as you do that, a couple other questions came in from Sarah Evans. You mentioned that Salesforce and TaroWorks have been great. How did you decide on these platforms? Are there other databases or mobile data collection tools you specifically considered?
For me, I came into it, which sounds like a dodge question or a dodge answer. But I found Salesforce and Towerworks combination when I came to Grameen Foundation. So I hadn't, prior to that, in a different organization, I had been doing a search for that what I'm calling essentially the comprehensive monitoring and evaluation system. So I've worked with, surveying tools, so anything that works on the E aspect. So these once-off surveying tools like ODK, Survey CTO, like these particular ones, and they're great and I love them, but they didn't have that database attached to it. And I had talked with, a number of developers who were just starting to develop out or wanted to evolve themselves and start to cover the monitoring space. So that space where you can have an off-the-shelf solution for continuous data collection. And just from my discussions, and it doesn't mean it's not out there, I was just reaching dead ends and a lot of constant, this is something you have to develop together, we have to custom build this. There is no solution for that. It doesn't mean they exist. I mean, I was searching in the East African space for this in particular. So that was just a quick snapshot of my research prior to it. But I did find Salesforce and TaroWorks working together when I came to Grameen Foundation, and I am, for a person who's been searching
Oh, Niamh? Yeah, I think you cut out for me at the very end. You said for a person who's been searching.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, sorry. I'm there. I ended nicely.
Okay. Okay. So another question that came in from Derek Opio from One Lamp is, for Principle 1, how can social enterprises involve target beneficiaries during the design of M&E systems?
Don't know specifically if social enterprises are much different than every other organization who needs to involve them. I guess the answer is, I mean, it depends on your processes, and it depends on what who these target beneficiaries actually are. Are they accessible to you? Do you need to go out there and conduct perhaps some focus group discussion, hold some interviews, hold some mobilizations with them in order to kind of understand their wants? I mean, they're not going to design your M&E system, but they can contribute to how realistic your theory of change is around the intervention that you're going to do.
Okay, great. And question came in from Cameron Khan. What is randomized control testing, and kind of how does it work with kind of an ongoing M&E system?
It doesn't really. So randomized control, perhaps trials, is what you're getting at. So that's an exclusively evaluation methodology. It's not something we've covered today, and it's a very high level impact assessment in which you would have greater confidence in your results. So this is usually done at impact level. So for example, if you wanted to have great confidence in if your project really did have a change in income, you could consider a randomized control trial if you have the resources available and the capacity, because they're pretty rigorous to implement, you could do that. And the main identifier of a randomized control trial is having what we call a counterfactual, which is essentially having creating or mimicking an environment in which the program did not take place. So quite simply, if you're working with smallholder farmers who are receiving X and Y intervention, you would do a baseline with them, an evaluation on the outcomes that you're interested in, but you would also have another set of farmers that receive nothing, and you would also do a baseline and evaluation on the outcomes as well, so you can see the difference between the two. So what happened in absence of an intervention to these farmers, and what happened during an intervention to these farmers. So it essentially has a stronger attribution level, that you can be more confident to say, my project potentially contributed to this change. But definitely that's a massive topic and training in its own.
Yeah. Great. A question from Alexi Kervins from JPHRO, JP Haitian Relief Organization. So if we have a system working with input data, starting to collect data, how do you choose the targets and compare that target to monitor progress?
I'm not entirely getting that question.
I guess, like if you're starting to collect data, how do you choose the indicators to track? I think, Alexi, that's your question. You can write back if you want to clarify.
Maybe, okay. I mean, with indicators, I mean, simply put, you're just trying to measure the change. So if I say that I want a high performance for my field agents, so I want them to, be highly performing, I would look at what they're supposed to do. So they are supposed to have 2 farmer meetings in a month, and they are supposed to have 25 of their farmers at their gardens in a month. So I would be looking at the proportion of community knowledge workers who have had 100% of meetings or X% of meetings. So very much aligning it with it. So if I'm interested in an increase in sales, by that same logic, I would look at the average kilos sold, the average price obtained, the percentage of farmers who have had an increase in their sales in kilos, these types of things. So just keeping it very simply, just translating to asking yourself the question, what will tell me that this was achieved? But I feel like, just as I look at this, I think you're thinking about targeting in general. So if I say I want a 20% increase in yield, is perhaps this is what you're thinking of. Then like how you develop targeting, it's a bit pie in the sky, but usually you would. It's a bit of it can be art and a science. So if you're looking for a 20% increase in yield, you should have kind of worked out what you intend to do that would achieve that 20% increase, and if that is realistic. For example, if you're really pushing fertilizers for yield, and there is scientific evidence out there that fertilizers increase by X percentage the yield, then that would help you set your targets as well.
Okay, great. Just wanted to do a time check. We have a couple more minutes before we wrap up. Niamh, I think you have one more slide left. Maybe as you're going to that, we'll get another question. What would you say is an okay threshold for bad data for a project?
Ooh. I like to, yeah. It can depend on the scale as well, you know, and it depends what data you're accepting. So for just I have a very low tolerance, particularly for bad data. So just to give you an example, I told the participants about the field-based quality assurance that we do. When we do a sample and we check if the farmer has actually adopted that practice. And we get and are satisfied with, you know, basically a 10 to 15% error rates with that. Because, and I guess we're satisfied in a way because we're working with, you know, 15,000 farmers, and each 15,000 farmer has chosen 5 practices. So you're working up to like 75,000 practices that can be adopted. So when we see, and this is the one that we usually see, like 90% valid, and this is something that, you know, we say we are satisfied with. But one important thing is that we actually report that. So in our reports, you know, both to our donors and to our teams, we say the rate on that. I think it's very important to have that transparency as well.
That's great. And just to give a little plug, we had actually done a TaroWorks webinar a few months ago, ways to track data inaccuracies and how to fix them on an ongoing basis. So you might want to check that out on the TaroWorks.org website. Okay, I think just in the interest of time, there are a couple other questions that came in, but I'm going to wrap this up. So we'll follow up with the separate questions outside of this. So thank you so much, Niamh. This was super interesting and super engaging. I definitely learned a lot, and hopefully everyone else did too. So thanks everyone for joining. See you next time.
Bye.